Howdy again everyone, and today I'm checking out a pretty extreme camera lens from Chinese manufacturer Meike, which is for APS-C mirrorless cameras, the Meike 25mm f/0.95. Its price is $370 or just over £300 here in the UK, and I'd like to thank Meike for sending me a copy of this lens for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. It's available for Fuji X, Nikon Z, Canon EF-M, Canon RF, Micro Four Thirds and Sony E-mount cameras, and the Sony version is what I'll be testing today. Alongside competing company Laowa's 25mm f/0.95 lens, this is the widest angle lens available on APS-C cameras with such an incredibly bright aperture, meaning that the resulting lens can get you quite wide angle photos, yet still with clearly out of focus backgrounds. Nice! It's about the equivalent of a full frame 38mm f1.4 lens, although obviously the light intensity of f/0.95 is greater, helping you to shoot in very dark situations. However, you must bear in mind that this lens is manual focus only. When shooting at f/0.95, that will really slow you down, although you do get used to manually focusing it after some practice. The lens itself is long and tubular in shape, not the most aesthetically pleasing thing I've ever seen. Made of metal, it weighs a somewhat hefty 600 grams. You'll really be able to tell that this thing is on top of your camera. It's based on a metal lens mount with no weather sealing. The lens is dominated by a large metallic manual focus ring. While it turns nice and smoothly, I do wish it did have a bit more precision for shooting at the widest apertures. As you can see here, the lens only suffers from a little focus breathing when focusing in and out. In front of the focus ring there's a manual aperture ring which turns completely smoothly, not my favourite thing in the world. The aperture stops are also very unevenly spaced, with huge gaps at wider apertures but only a few millimeters between f8 and f16. The lens has a 62mm filter size and comes with a slip-on lens cap, which I found to slip off the front of the lens a little too easily. Overall, the lens's build quality is pretty basic here, and I wasn't a huge fan of the design of its control rings. Well, let's move on and look at image quality now. I'll be testing it on a Sony a5100 with its 24MP APS-C sensor. No in-camera corrections are available with this lens. At f/0.95 there is some sharpness to be seen in the middle, but it's clouded over by ghosting and very low contrast, unfortunately. If the middle looked bad, the corners look terrible, with a ton of uneven and soft resolution. Stop down to f1.4 for a little more brightness in the corners, but no more detail. Back in the middle, a lot of that ghosting has gone, but contrast is still quite weak. However, stop down to f2 for spectacular picture quality in the middle. The corners, still pretty dreadful unfortunately. Stop down to f4 for an improvement in the corners, and at f5.6 and f8 we finally see corner sharpness. The lens stays this sharp down to f16, where a little softness is creeping in again due to diffraction. Overall though, there's simply no dressing up this lens's rather awful performance here. It's essentially unusable at f/0.95, and you'll have to really stop down for any kind of sharpness to emerge outside of the middle of the image. Okay, let's take a look at distortion and vignetting now. More bad news here. Across the middle of the field, the lens's distortion looks fine until the image is suddenly pulled backwards at you in the corners. Vignetting at f/0.95 is very intrusive. Even if you stop down to f2 or f2.8, there's some sharp corner darkness to be seen here. Next, close-up image quality. The lens can focus down to 25cm, which is great, but unfortunately you can barely even see anything when focusing that closely at f/0.95. f1.4 and f2 see improvements, but it's only at f2.8 that sharpness returns again. Ouch. Alright, let's look at how the lens performs against bright light. While I've seen worse than this before, it's still not a pretty picture. There are lots of problems with flaring patterns here that can get pretty intrusive in your pictures. While we're working in the dark, let's take a look at chroma levels. Somewhat unsurprisingly, they are not good. We see plenty of smearing here on bright points of light in the corners of your images. They are just as bad at f1.4, reduced at f2, and at f2.8 those points of light look very clean finally. Let's zoom out and look for sun stars. Unfortunately, even if you stop down to f11, there's nothing much to see here. Let's take a look at the quality of this lens's bokeh now. On the whole, those out-of-focus backgrounds look okay, but at f0.95, specular highlights have the strongest cat's eye shape to them I've pretty much ever seen, so that can make your images look pretty weird sometimes. And finally, related to bokeh comes longitudinal chromatic aberration. At f0.95, well, we can barely see anything due to that terrible close-up image quality. Here's f1.4 and now f2, where you can see that colour fringing on bokeh highlights actually doesn't seem to be too much of an issue with this lens. Overall, well, this lens's performance was somewhere between poor and whatever comes below poor. Optical problems lay scattered left, right and centre, and it wasn't a pleasure for me to wade through the resulting detritus. A swing and a miss unfortunately this time. I'd avoid this lens on APS-C cameras, but considering that the worst issues were confined to the image corners, it might perform a little better on a micro 4/3 camera system with its smaller crop. Gah, I wish Christmas took place at different times of the year across the UK, so I could always go and get pretty sample pictures. If you found this review helpful, or any of my other reviews, and you want to see them keep coming, then check out my Patreon page down below, where supporters can find all kinds of exclusive bonus content. Ciao for now, everybody.